check engine lights, heavy oil consumption, oil leaks, or catastrophic engine failures to where some people have engines that won't even make it 4 or 5 years simply because of this technology under the hood. We're going to talk about direct fuel injection, some of the catastrophic failures it can impose on a vehicle, and why in fact there are better alternatives. Let's get into it now. A few weeks ago we had our Mercedes-Benz fail. We had a check engine light pop up onto the dash, and then the vehicle started to run a little bit rough. You could tell something was amiss, something wasn't quite right. So I decided to pull up my code reader and plugged into the OBD2 port sensor, and I realized I found something out. There was a positive crankcase ventilation system fault. And what could that possibly be? Well, back in the day with most vehicles, 10, 20 years ago, a lot of these failures and a lot of these PCVs were easily replaced by a $5 or $10 part at about 10 minutes of your time. But things have changed a lot, and after that check engine light, I took the vehicle into the dealer, and the dealer looked it over and confirmed that there was an outstanding failure with regards to the PCV system in a modern day Mercedes-Benz. But it doesn't begin and end with Mercedes, because almost every manufacturer these days is running PCVs because it's a positive crankcase ventilation. It's taking the waste blow-by gases from the engine and re-putting it back in so it can reuse some of the fueling, some of the gases, and ultimately reduce the pressure in the crankcase. Now, what I started to realize, because a viewer reached out to me, Ed Kumel actually reached out and dropped a line and said, "Thanks, Ed," because he pointed out some key factors and some major contributing factors with that. A lot of these PCVs now are related or indirectly related to direct fuel injection. That's right, we've talked about direct fuel injection or GDI engines in previous videos, and I've explained that you have to make sure you do frequent oil changes, and it has to have that certain certification on the oil, check on the back of the bottle, that actually is designed for direct fuel injected engines. Because along with this improved fuel economy, efficiency, performance that direct injected engines provide, there are some drawbacks. And no longer can you get away with that $10 PCV. But in fact, Ed dropped a line and said, look, a lot of these recommended oil services are just not adequate. And I totally agree. You know, this 10,000 mile oil service intervals are absolutely ludicrous. I've talked about that in our Toyota videos. But as well with these, I would strongly recommend, as did Ed, that you go as low as 5,000 miles or about 8,000 kilometers. I would even almost comment and say go 3,000 miles or 5,000 kilometers. Ultimately, go back to something more conventional. And it's not that the oil can't handle it. It's simple because there's sludge buildup and development, and ultimately that leads to contributing factor to deterioration of that PCV, which plays a much more critical role in the life of a lot of these modern day engines. Now, there are some manufacturers that try to mitigate some of these problems, and a lot of them do it with the use of not just direct fuel injection, but they toggle over to port fuel injection, which doesn't have half of these issues. Because when you have too much built up, pent up pressures in the crankcase, and the PCV isn't relieving that pressure under the vacuum conditions that it takes to re-inject those blow-by gases, it starts to build up excess pressure. And that excess pressure now can cause a host of issues other than just a check engine light. So if you have a CEL on a modern day direct injected engines, never ever ignore it. First of all, I'll check your fuel cap. Did you just recently fuel up? Did you maybe not tighten that down all the way? Because having a poorly installed fuel cap is all it takes sometimes to ignite a check engine light. And if after 5 minutes of driving the check engine light still exists, maybe pull out an OBD2 code reader if you have one, or go take the vehicle down to the dealership and plug in underneath there and see what that code will tell you. A lot of older vehicles were just a lot more tolerant to check engine lights. Maybe you had an O2 sensor people drive around with for years, and it doesn't necessarily harm the vehicle all that much. A lot of check engine lights aren't necessarily critical, although they should all be inspected, and that's why they're called check engine light. That being said, a lot of new vehicles are far more tight tolerances and require immediate inspection on anything, because even a misfire on a turbocharged small displacement 4-cylinder or 3-cylinder turbo engine means that you're losing a significant output. Not only that, the unbalance and the resonance throughout the drivetrain can cause other problems. It also causes extra sludge and other running and operating conditions by simply having a misfire. So a check engine light is always something you want to have looked at in any modern day vehicle. But in this case, when you're dealing with a PCV, a lot of them tend to fail prematurely in vehicles like this. I mean, we had a PCV failure. It was a conglomeration of hoses and tubes and connections, and ultimately it redirects those blow-by gases back into a place that's less harmful, allows that vacuum to pull that pressure out of the crankcase, and allows the vehicle to breathe properly. Without that system functioning properly, and if it doesn't allow those pressures to release, you can have a whole host of issues. Some of them we actually experienced ourselves. As soon as that check engine light came up, I knew something was wrong because the vehicle was running a little bit sloppily. It was a little bit of a juddering. You could feel it wasn't running as smooth as it normally did, so you knew there was something up. And that's one of the classic symptoms. So is a lacking in fuel efficiency. You start to lose some of that fuel efficiency. If you drove it long enough, you'd probably start to realize that you're not getting as many miles out of a tank of fuel. On top of it, some people keep a misfunctioning PCV system running for a period of time will also notice increased oil consumption, largely in some cases out of the tailpipe. Sometimes you'll just realize that all of a sudden upon doing your weekly checks for your oil levels, you'll notice that a lot of times the oil level's down when it's not typically been the case. You know, normally you have a vehicle that never has to add oil between oil services, and all of a sudden you've had check engine light for 3 or 4 weeks and you've had to add an extra quart of oil when you normally didn't have to. That could be another sign. Now, as I've said, you could have a faulty PCV activate other problems. You can have not just oil consumption, but catastrophic engine failure as a result of the fact that it's not relieving that pressure. You could have engine failure outright. You could have, ultimately, in the worst case scenario, if you keep it long enough, piston rings deteriorating and engine failure altogether, and actually have to face the mechanics when they're telling you that you have to own up and pay $18,000 for a new engine. Unfortunately, that is a reality if you neglect things like the PCV, but these PCVs have to work a lot harder than they ever did, largely because of these directly fuel injected engines. They create a lot more pressure. We know direct injected engines operate on the premise of putting the fuel, pressurized fuel, directly into the combustion chamber, rather than some of the older fuel systems like the port injection, where it puts it in, mixes fuel and air, and then puts it in a common plenum. Of course, that system's a lot less regulated, but it worked, and it worked for years. Same with carbureted systems, they all work. Direct fuel injection systems have been around a long time, but they do create other problems. While they are efficient, there are other issues you can expect because of the increased blow-by pressures that you're getting. A lot of times you're hearing what Hondas, in some cases, a lot of these vehicles, when you go to check your oil, you take a sniff of this, pull off your engine lid, take a whiff of that, or even pull out your dipstick, and you're going to give it a smell, and you're going to find in some cases you're getting this gas smell, heavy gas smell. A lot of times it's because these direct injected engines push high pressure fuel, especially when an engine's cool. The rings don't necessarily seal as well, and what sometimes you end up doing is putting fuel past the rings, especially on a cold engine, and ultimately sometimes it winds up down in the oily section of the engine, and ultimately what does that result in? Fuel and oil dilution. And that's a common issue that Honda's had with their 1.5s, and a lot of common issues with a lot of these direct injected engines. That's why the technology, while it works great and it certainly is more efficient, it creates a whole new host of problems, like expensive repairs like the PCV failures, or some of this oil and fuel dilution, which means it's even more critical that you do your oil services when the manufacturer says, no, scratch that. Way before, in my personal opinion, than the manufacturer recommends. As I've said, 3,000 to 5,000 miles, absolutely top. Don't wait for 10,000 miles, because now you've got all that extra fuel, in some cases down on the bottom of the case of the engine, and of course that's now potentially wreaking havoc when you get those extra fumes that are coming out of the system that ultimately gets re-injected, and of course all of that fuel, which is a solvent, starts to wreak havoc on the entire system. PCV systems are one of those that just take all the sludge and soot and all the smoke and stank that comes out of the engine, and it goes through there. So it's no wonder that they take a real toll, and sometimes are some of the first symptoms of an engine that needs more maintenance. So there still are some manufacturers that are using two different types of fuel injection systems, port as well as a direct injection. Of course, Toyota, a lot of times, and Lexus vehicles are still utilizing some of that technology to eliminate some of the carbon, the sludge buildup, and of course some of the sludge and all of that extra mess that you get on the intake valves, and some of that contamination you get throughout the engine means that Toyota and Lexus were looking and engineering their vehicles in such a way that they were able to keep some of those problems at bay, reducing the number of failures, the issues with the PCV system, more efficient running, less carbon buildup in the intake manifolds. But ultimately, a lot of manufacturers find that they have these types of problems. Complex systems like these new PCVs are no longer $40 or $20. They are now a convoluted setup. This one here actually was apparently worth $500 or $600 for the part, and it was about 7 hours labor for the dealers to actually make the repair. Now, fortunately, in this situation, it was covered under the extended warranty by Mercedes-Benz, but that's not always the case with every single manufacturer. In many cases, it simply just isn't. And so that repair is going to be on you. So that's why ultimately the best thing you can do is keep good fuel in your vehicle. Make sure you're doing frequent oil services in that 3,000 to 5,000 mile range with that specified additive in these new, that it's designed for these new direct injected engines. And then basically more long trips, less short trips. Those start and stop trips, not great for an engine. Let the vehicle warm up, put it longer trips, more freeway drives. Those are the best way to keep the vehicle running well. Well, I hope that helps. And with all of that said, be sure to check out the resolution, how we got past this and how we managed to keep our Mercedes-Benz on the road. Hope to see each and every one in the next one, everybody. See you real soon. Bye-bye.